So if you've been to one of these presentations before, you'll remember that the I-STARR project is supported by a grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's part of the larger NIH Helping to End Addiction Long-Term, or the HEAL initiative, and it's also one of several projects that comprise the Consortium on Addiction Recovery Science, or the COARS network. So this webinar today is actually the 11th webinar in a 12-part I-STARR researcher training series. And it's the 9th webinar that's geared specifically towards folks who would like to be studying or researching recovery housing. So heretofore, each webinar in the researcher training series has focused on a specific methodological aspect of research and had researchers, particularly recovery housing research, present on that topic. So this webinar is slightly different because our presenters are different. They have different experience, different but equally essential expertise on recovery housing and specifically recovery housing operations, which we'll be talking about today. In fact, we'll be talking about the many challenges of operating a recovery residence. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm Amy Maracle. I'm a research scientist in the Alcohol Research Group at the Public Health Institute. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Dr. Carmen Masson, who is a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. The team also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore and Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Mina Subbaraman and Libo Lee, communications specialists Dustin Kebsu and Diane Schmidt, and the team's project coordinator is Quinoja Capitani. Next slide, please. So the I-STARR project activities are guided by a 17-member advisory board, and our advisory board is comprised of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. Our advisory board members represent recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, and national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. We may have some of our advisory board members in the audience. I haven't scrolled through and seen everyone, but I'm also pleased to say that throughout this webinar series, several of our advisory board members present at these webinars as part of the series. So let's go to the next slide. So that's a little bit of background on the I-STARR project. But before I introduce today's webinar and webinar presenters, we'd like to do some quick polling to get a sense of who's here in the audience today. And they're just 4 questions in our poll. And let's launch the poll now. So the first question is, what best describes your field of study? The second question is, at what stage are you in your studies in this field? And the third question, have you ever visited a recovery residence? And the last one, do you know anyone who operates or who manages a recovery residence? So we'll give folks a little bit of time to answer those questions. You need to answer all of them, I think, to clear the screen. But once you have, just hit submit. And if you can't see all questions, you might have to scroll to view them all. And once everyone has answered the questions, or we have a good representation of who's on the call, we'll share the polling results with everyone on the call. And here are the results. So it looks like the largest percentage of folks are in health sciences, but we also have a number of folks who are showing up as something else. So if you're in that something else category, feel free to drop in the chat what that would be so that we can better capture that in subsequent webinars. So in terms of stage in your studies, most folks have completed their training 10 years or more ago. So folks who have been in the field for a while, which is great. And in terms of visiting a recovery residence, we do have at least half of the folks on the call have visited a recovery residence, and more than half, well more than half, almost 2/3, have or know someone who owns or operates or manages a recovery residence. So this is great. I mean, I think that we'll have folks who are relatively new to the operations of recovery housing, but people who also might be a little bit more familiar, and will be good for folks to share their experiences. When we kind of at the end, when we talk about operating a recovery residence. So let's go to our next slide. So let me tell you a little bit about who you'll be hearing from today. So our primary presenter is Fred Way, and he's the one who is primarily responsible for making the magic happen for today's webinar. So Fred Way is the founder and the executive director of the Pennsylvania Association of Recovery Residences, or PAR, as well as a former president, current treasurer, and charter board member of the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, or NAR. He is also the former administrator for the special initiatives for the City of Philadelphia Office of Addiction Services, in which he worked for 18 years before leaving to build PAR into NAR's Pennsylvania affiliate. So Fred has dedicated his career to working with and assisting individuals with substance use and mental challenges, all the while creating an atmosphere of change and overseeing more than 200 staff members over the course of his career. As a charter member of the NAR board, he helped develop the NAR standard for recovery housing and has assisted a number of state-level NAR affiliates in ensuring that residents adhere to it. For more than a decade, he's been at the forefront of Pennsylvania's fight against the opioid epidemic, advising lawmakers on state policy and leading the charge to define and implement standards for the state's hundreds of recovery residences. In addition to serving on the NAR board, Fred also is a member of the board of directors for New Jerusalem Now and the Bridge Foundation. He's presented at academic and professional conferences and co-authored scholarly publications on the topic of recovery housing. And I feel just delighted to have Fred presenting at this researcher training webinar, because 15 years ago, it was Fred who was absolutely critical to my own learning about recovery housing. And so it's a real treat to have Fred be a part of other researchers training about recovery housing as well. So without further ado, let's hear from Fred Way.
Thank you, Amy, for that wonderful introduction. So, welcome everyone. And today's presentation will be on the many challenges of operating a recovery residence, which is something that I have been doing or been helping recovery residents do for the last over 20 years. Next slide. So, a recovery residence is a sober, safe, and healthy living environment that promote recovery from alcohol and drug abuse and promote stability. Next slide. So, the NAR Standard 3.0. Prior to 2012, there was not a standard or any kind of operational rules to a recovery house. You know, once the standard was developed, it gave the operators the opportunity to have a guide to be able to operate their recovery residence. And in that guide is domains. The domain 1 is administrative operations. Domain 2 is physical environment. Domain 3 is recovery support. And domain 4 is good neighbor. And what I'm talking about just briefly is a couple of the principles for those domains. In domain 1, which is recovery, is administrative operations. You need to be operating with integrity, uphold residents' rights, create a culture of empowerment where residents engage in governance and leadership, develop staff abilities to apply the social model. Domain 2, we want to provide a home-like environment, promote a safe and healthy environment. 3, facilitate active recovery and recovery community engagement, model psychosocial behaviors and relationship enhancement skills, and cultivate the residents' sense of belonging and responsibility for the community. And then domain 4, which is the resident operations should be a good neighbor in the community. Next slide. So when we are looking at a recovery residence operational challenges, okay, you have 1, which is operator owner research due diligence, 2, property location, 3, zoning laws and capacity limits, and community acceptance, and NIMBY, and 5, which is budget funding model. Now, when we're going in to certify these recovery residences, we are looking at every one of these, okay, to make sure that they meet what we're expecting them to meet per the standard. Next slide. Okay, 1, operator owner research and due diligence. Now, for 1, the operator could be an existing operator or a new operator, okay? And those questions would be, okay, if they're existing, okay, then we would go in and work with them on the domains and the standard to make sure that they meet all the standards to be able to be a certified recovery residence. If you are a new operator, what we're looking at is do you want to be a operator for a recovery residence? And have you done your due diligence around all those areas, to be able to operate a recovery residence? Next slide. Number 2 is property location. Okay, where is your recovery residence? Obviously, there are locations that where are better than others. For instance, you should not probably have a recovery residence next to a school. That's actually is as a deterrent, for you. You want to make sure that it's close to transportation. You want to make sure that it actually meets the neighborhood that where you're trying to either have your existing residence or open up a new one. Next slide. When you are looking at a recovery residence, okay, you have to consider the zoning laws and capacity limits, okay? Where zoning laws vary from state to state, you should know whether or not your property is zoned correctly to operate as a recovery residence. And if it's not, what do you need to do, or what help do you need to be able to get it zoned, for you to be able to operate as a recovery residence? Understand that you can operate a recovery residence, without being zoned. It's not a recommendation, okay? I mean, because it's best to be able to, have all your ducks in a row. Therefore, at some point, you would like to be able to get some type of funding for your house, and if it's zoned incorrectly, per whatever state that you may be in, you will not be eligible for that. And also the capacity of your property. You don't want to overcrowd it. You do not want to have more individuals in there that it can hold. Okay, that is something that we look at. We look at the square footage of the rooms that you have in your house to make sure that you are not putting more individuals in there that it can hold. Next slide. Now, if you met 1, 2, and 3, now here's the community acceptance. Okay, in many communities, and I will say that this is less now, that NIMBY, which means not in my backyard, where the community would stand up and really be resistant to recovery residences in their neighborhood. Okay, with the onset of, I would say, more education and individuals that are out there, talking to the community around what exactly a recovery residence is and how it's supposed to operate, okay? And also the fact that houses that we're working with operate with standards, we tend to see NIMBY less. However, it is still out there, and the operator also needs to understand that if the community does rise up, it could permit them from not being able to open or operate their recovery residence. Next slide. Number 5, budget and funding model. When I'm speaking with operators around their recovery residence, one of my initial questions is, do you have a budget? And if you don't, then you need to at least try to create one. Okay, we will definitely help you create that budget. Okay, because a lot of times a operator will want to open up a recovery residence because it's their passion, because it's something they wanted to do, because someone left them this property and they want to give something back, because 90% of recovery residence operators have probably lived in a recovery house one time through their life, and they want to do something and put something back in, so they want to open one up, which is not always an easy task. So you need to make sure that you have the financial ability to be able to do that. Along with a recovery residence, there are funding models. The models are whether or not you are a funded recovery residence or a unfunded recovery residence. And the difference is a funded recovery residence probably has a contract with the behavioral health entity of that particular state that they're in and or city, okay, that where they're being helped by that particular city, okay, to help them run that recovery residence. And the other funding model is the unfunded, which means that that recovery residence is not receiving any kind of assistance in funds, and they are depending on the resident to be able to pay resident monthly fees. That model has its difficulties because you are requiring the resident to go out, find a job, and be able to pay you weekly, your fees to be able to maintain the running of the recovery residence. Okay, and there it's a model that definitely I have seen over the last couple of years that many recovery residences have had to shut down because they cannot sustain their recovery residence because they have a lack of funds to be able to do that, which is a shame because we need as many recovery residences in the community to be able to help these individuals as they move through their recovery. Next slide. So we have a great opportunity today. We have 3 speakers that will be talking to you around the operational challenges of their in recovery residences, one in the unfunded residences, and then one in the funded residences. And you will hear the differences that may be similar and also obviously different. So our first up will be John Carlson, who is the Executive Director of Transformation to Recovery in Philadelphia, PA. I've known John for quite a while. He is a wonderful guy and runs an exceptional recovery residence that is also certified by the Pennsylvania Alliance of Recovery Residences. And I will turn this over to John.
Thank you, Fred. And just a note, you're a great mentor and a leader and a teacher, and that is truth, because I've known you for 10 years now, and you have guided me to this position where we're at. And we are unfunded, and I want to note, we are still open, and we're open for business. So let me first start by saying the positives outweigh the challenges. So we see on a monthly basis here, restoration of lives through transformation, sobriety, and growth from the support of recovery housing. So taking someone from destruction, such as myself, and seeing them grow to maturity with a new purpose, and now contributing to the community, that's priceless. And that's why we endure the challenges. And without challenges, by the way, there is no growth. Count it all joy when we go through challenges. So the following are challenges that I see that are common for unfunded houses And so this is to make you aware of the challenges, and that are possible, but not necessarily the answers to them. We continue to journey through research and policy changes for the answers. And so next slide. These are the things I pointed out that just came right off the top of my head on that. So number one, staying consistent with your policies and rules with ever-changing environment. And what we have to look at in there too is recovery maturity and negative or positive behaviors in that environment. So I remember my first recovery house owner when I was in recovery. I asked him what's the best thing as operating a recovery house, and what's the best thing to focus on? What's your number one thing? And he said the number one priority is consistency. So if we do differently or favor someone else from the others, and then you'll lose integrity, which is one of the principles of recovery housing that Fred spoke about. And so that is so historically true, and that is why we set policies and follow them, and are accountable to NAR and PAR standards to stay consistent. We also got to look at funding as a challenge, as was just noted. I find it typically hard seeking out recovery house funding, obviously. And in this day, most grants and funding are contingent on whether your house is licensed or certified or in politically, let's say. So the answer to that is yes, to zone your house properly and get the necessary certifications and licensing. However, we still have a recovery house managers and operators specializing on program developments and not grant writing, right? We're doing recovery planning. We're doing program planning. We're caring for the individuals, but we're not grant writers. We might be, but most of us aren't. And so as Roland Lamb would say, the struggle continues with that. So we need to seek out recovery house grant administration services. That's one of the things that I would love to see happen. Another thing is collecting rent and fees. That's always been a challenge. We are in a recovery environment, right? I myself am from a background of destruction and addiction, and then now rebuilding. So we're not leasing a mortgage to perfect financial stewards, are we? Anywhere. And so collecting rent is going to be a challenge, even with a promise and a signature. So we use contingency planning. It's a good opportunity for teaching as well, the importance of responsibility with paying your dues. By the way, just to give you a tip here, our rent and fees are included in their goals, their program goals. And this is part of the disciple program of growth for us. It's more than just collecting to do, it's a teaching how to be responsible for that, because they got to finally go out on their own. So also we talk about relapse policies, right? Again, we're working with people with in recovery from substance abuse, right? And relapse, and that is always in play. It's always in the background. There could be a relapse coming. And so the recovery program needs to have a relapse policy. And I hope that policy is not the kick out plan. What we do is, we got to ask our question, what are we going to do when someone relapses? We're here to help people in addiction, right? That's what we're doing. And so how are we going to work with this person towards restoration? And that should be our goal. I'm not going to say much about discipline. We know about that, but discipline's major, and it's another teaching tool that helps folks in the house to be restored back in the community with a purpose. Discipline plays a major role in that. Licensing and certification updates. Fred talked about zoning. We have to do the research. We have to have the education behind us to understand where and when, who's the state or federal licensing board agency. And as operators, we need to stay up with this. We need to bring on administration to follow this, because it could be very lengthy and technical, and we need research and we need update. And that just brings us another challenge. Who's paying for the administrator, right, to do these things? Maintenance of the building, huge operational costs. All right, I'm just going to leave that right there. But that, doing your research again, there's many recovery transitional grants out there that can help you with that, to continue with the maintenance. We need to also choose the correct data software. When we took over the house, the current owners of the house, they used what are they called? Note cards. And they had thousands of note cards all over the desk with everybody's information on it. No, now we have to be in the data world, right? In networking and computer and understanding all kinds of things in data that can collect measurements and growth data and of course who's in your house. Also keeping and recruiting a good house manager. That is key. First of all, it's key to run your house correctly. And second of all, again, it's key for the growth of the person. That is an advancement stage to someone who just came in the house and now they worked their way up maturity wise, where they are now at a level of house manager. I know operators, agree with this. If we have the right accountable person managing their house, then things are easier. But this is not always the case. Again, we are dealing with growth and maturity levels, inexperience or experience. So patience, I find, is the key. And some of the questions you got to ask: are we stipending that manager, or are we giving them free rent, or especially in a non-funded house? Those are things that are critically at our forefront. And then last but not least, overnight crisis. Sometimes we're so excited to help people and get out there and passionate, and we go get our house and we forget that, hey, things happen overnight too. They don't just happen during the day. So we need to have a contingency plan for night. There's a lot of 2 a.m. crisis happening at the Hope House. And we could tie that into having a good house manager, someone who lives at the premises, who knows what to do right away, and simply 911 as well. But we have to keep in the forefront that you are going to eventually have an overnight crisis, and what are you going to do about it? So those are my top 10 challenges. Thank you.
Next up, presenting will be the Joy of Living Recovery Program with the CEO and Executive Director, Stephanie Scully, and her Managing Director, Charlene Lianes. And I must say, I've known both of these ladies for a number of years. This program, when it was an unfunded program, and the due diligence of them working to be now, for I guess the last 10 years, a funded program. So I throw it to you, Stephanie and Charlene.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Just a brief introduction of myself. I am a person in long-term recovery. I am one of the first pioneers to open recovery homes over 20 years ago. And the Not in My Backyard thing was a big thing that I fought with city council and town meetings that we had. There was a lot of stigma with people that were recovering. They felt like they were going to, relapse and then steal their cars, and it was just a lot of negativity, and a lot of it was based on fear and uneducated. They were uneducated. So I'm glad that we persisted and we're able to, continue to do what we do. And being a person in long-term recovery, I feel that anyone who wishes to run or operate a recovery house, you have to have a passion for it. You can't look at the money in it, because there's days when we can't even pay bills. And it's about, like John said, it's just about helping the next person get their life back and have them achieve their, long-term goals. Trying to hit on some things that John was talking about is, to continuously evaluate and improve our service delivery, because not every policy, they've changed over the years. We're consistently just putting new policies together because times change. We used to not do MAT, and MAT is basically the medicated assisted treatment, is basically how a lot of people are recovering. So we were open to that, and we changed policies on that. The zoning and everything that is required to run a recovery house is something that was stigmatized too, and there was a moratorium on zoning for recovery homes a while ago. And speaking with city council and stuff like that, it was lifted, and we were able to open up more homes. So currently we have 2 sites that are funded, which house 49 individuals, and we have over 10 sites that are non-funded and people that are living there long term. I can say on the non-funded side, sometimes there's challenges with collecting the rent fees and stuff like that. But being a community partner and embracing, and helping the community, we have some nonprofits that will sponsor individuals because they know that they're doing the right thing, You don't say anything? Because
So I felt like John was a tough act to follow. He definitely covered all the bases, but our work in being a non-funded provider is what led us, our reputation and the amount of people that we were helping, and the advocacy and outreach that was required to maintain recovery houses at that stature is what led us to become eventually a funded house, right? To contract or subcontract through the city and the Department of Drug and Alcohol programs. 3 years ago, licensing had come through. Prior to that, we were an affiliate of I-STARR. That was the only standard for recovery housings in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And, Stephanie has always set the standard, and we were in line with I-STARR's quality of housing, right? Because there were a lot of properties in our area where recovery is very prevalent that would call themselves recovery houses, but did not meet those expectations. And with that came that stigma that, people didn't want recovery houses where there was individuals that there was constant use or lack of supervision. And overcoming that was definitely difficult, and is still one of those challenges that we have. Some of the referrals we received come directly from prisons. And there was a lot of stigma attached to prison transport, where sheriffs are arriving at our door and uncuffing individuals in shackles and releasing them. So, one of those challenges were averted by having them transported to the local outpatient provider, to the treatment facility. But with that now comes the difficulty of, once they arrive there, now they're left to their own devices without transportation, sometimes without medication, to arrive at our facility. And, you have an individual who's done a long-term, placement in prison and possibly a therapeutic community within that environment, who now is in their old neighborhood and run into somebody, and they never actually make it to our facility because the supports that we have available were never capable of being implemented. With that, individuals who do graduate our program successfully are always our first choice for staff. Individuals who have slept in the same bed and have that lived experience, who can say, I followed the rules that this program is enforcing. I've lived in this space and I've been able to transform my life. They have become our greatest assets as staff members. And there's a lot invested in that, and their gratitude in giving back to the program through service as an employee, speaks volumes. But with that comes the challenge once somebody becomes, like a really valued employee, because we have those budget stipulations as being a funded provider. You have a non-funded private institution that is dealing constantly. You know, they have phone calls, and how we connect on a treatment team model with outpatients or other houses, and they almost poach, you know, our staff, knowing that they're good and they're reliable and that they communicate well and they've been well trained and that their sobriety is strong, that, you know, they now seek to kind of steal employees from you. So maintaining good employees and good staff after you've invested in them with those budget restrictions and limitations on their salary and what we're capable of offering them, you know, doesn't compare to a private institution that doesn't have those same levels of restriction or budgeting limitations. So I feel like they're probably two of the top concerns on these list of 10. And then, of course, maintenance. Maintenance of any building with the licensing requirements is just expensive. Obviously, post-COVID, the cost of everything has completely increased, and our income has not, you know, so trying to still operate within those limitations has definitely been a challenge.
Yeah, so funding can be challenging because, you know, you have a fixed allocation and then you have this inflation that happens throughout the years, and they don't want to give you any more money. You put an increased budget together and they say, no, not this year, no, not this year. Fred knows, you know, and like I'm trying to like make it work, and it can be challenging. So therefore we try to utilize other nonprofits that can sponsor or help the people maintain. A lot of them don't even want to pay their fees because they're required to pay a certain amount of their SNAP benefits, you know, to put towards food. That was one way that the city had said that we could, you know, get some money to kind of help us with this increase, and it's difficult. And getting back to the bullet points here with the relapse policies, like John said, like you have to have some kind of, you have to have that formatted where when an individual does relapse, or, you know, it's not about just throwing them out. It's about wrapping supports to help them, give them a behavior agreement, request a linkage meeting with their counselor so that we can wrap these supports around them. And, you know, you may have an individual that relapses a couple times, but like, at least they're making it home. At least they're not getting, you know, relapsing and then running the street. You know, they may slip up outside and come back and ask, you know, for help. And our job is to wrap those supports around that individual, you know. And Charlene talked about the maintenance of the building. It's very important that we continue to maintain the building, because there's a huge, as an owner, me being a recovery house owner, there's a huge, there's liability there. You know, you could be sued. You could have somebody on medication who tripped, you know, because the floor was wet. Well, did you have the mop sign up? You know what I mean? So staff has to be trained to follow those procedures so that we can protect the company as a whole too. And then overnight crisis, you wanted to say, you know, God forbid somebody, go ahead.
So our staff are actually trained if there's, God forbid, an overdose on site, or there's somebody that's unresponsive, to only state that when we call 911 to reduce that stigma. Obviously, we are community partners. You know, we try to connect with the police department and fire department and really work cohesively with them, but there still is, unfortunately, a stigma attached to people in recovery and substance users. So we just say, you know, that somebody's unresponsive and we need a, you know, medical team or medical response on site. But the neighborhood starts to know, you know who we are. They know the address. They know it's a recovery house. And sometimes the response isn't as quick as we need it to be, you know, especially if there's a conflict or a physical altercation, or you know, we have a women's house where sometimes there you know, there's domestic violence issues, and individuals find out that their ex-spouse or partner is living there, and now you have a house full of women that could be threatened by you know, volatile or angry male, you know. So keeping the community safe and the house safe is definitely a top priority and can be challenging at times.
And it's critical for each staff member to be certified to administer Narcan. because you could save a life before rescue gets here. And that's important. And I think that's all we have. We're just here for questions.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Charlene. Next slide. Medication challenges. As MAT and MAR and MOUD have obviously increased over the last, I would say, 10 years, where there's an understanding, around these three areas. MAT was first up, and now MAR seems to be, one that is more prevalent, and the more education and awareness and less stigma around will actually help these challenges, around medicated assisted treatment and also MOUD. Next slide. And the challenges by the medication type, I mean, methadone is probably the least accepted medication I know in the recovery residences that I certify. There are operators who will not even accept funding if they have to be able to take methadone in their recovery residence. Okay, and it's not going to change. Obviously, more education around all these areas is definitely what's needed. Buprenorphine and Suboxone, along with the Naltrexone and Vivitrol, seems to be the two medications that the recovery residences are much more accepting to. But hopefully, as we say, we work on this as we move forward, that it'll be much more acceptance. Here in Pennsylvania, you have to take all forms of MAT to be a licensed recovery resident. Okay, and that's the only way to get any funding here in this state around recovery residences. Next slide. Now I'll throw it back to you, Amy.
Wow, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you, Fred, John, Stephanie, Celine. Just super well done. Very comprehensive. And thank you for sharing all the things that your job entails. And I hope that that's what researchers will take away from this, is that operating a recovery residence is so multifaceted, that there are so many things on your plate that you're thinking about, from the residents to the neighbors, and to the plumbing, to policies at the state level. That it is very, very complex what you guys are doing, and thank you for what you're doing. So we've tried to cram as much as we can about recovery residence operations into this webinar, but there's only so much that we can do in an hour. So we've tried to pull together some resources for folks if you want to learn more about what goes into operating a recovery residence. Let's go to the next slide. The presenters have curated a list of some research articles on the topic, as well as some other resources that might be helpful as you're learning about what happens in recovery housing and what operators do in recovery housing. We'll drop those into the chat so that you can point and click and access those resources. And I want to thank Fred for allowing us to list his email address in case folks have questions about recovery residence operations, or about the resources or additional resources that you're interested in. Let's go to the next slide. So at this point, you guys have been super patient and holding off on asking questions of our amazing presenters. But at this point, I do want to turn things over to our audience members. We have amazing resources here with Fred, John, Stephanie, and Celine. Feel free to unmute yourselves and raise your hand to ask a question, or feel free to drop your questions into the chat, and we can call on folks. And Diane, do you want to take over at this point?
Sure. Thanks so much, Amy, and thanks everybody. This was, such an incredible talk. So in the chat, I don't know, Danny, if you want to unmute yourself and ask about the programs. And I think these are the programs that Soline and Stephanie were speaking to. But if you had a clarifying question, her question was, are these programs available to those out of state?
They are, but most people that come in may need some kind of assistance from the county, be it welfare or their benefits, medical benefits. So we do bring them in, we give them a residency letter. They'd have to become a Pennsylvania resident in order to get those benefits.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mhm.
Danny, if there's anything else about that question, just yeah, just unmute yourself or drop it into the chat and we can ask any clarifying questions. I don't have any other questions in the chat, but this is a great time to be asking these experts on recovery residences and even things around how researchers can work with recovery residences. So please feel free to raise your hand or drop something in the chat. Or Amy, I don't know if you have any questions for our presenters.
So Fred, I really like how you kind of broke down the terms funded and unfunded. So one way to think about that is kind of residences that are primarily supported through resident fees, where residents are self-funded, versus residences that have contracts that will help cover the expenses. Because I think that in Philadelphia is very lucky in that there is this funding stream through the city to provide those contracts to recovery housing.
Oh, you're muted, Fred.
Sorry about that. Yes, actually, other cities and other states have started some type of funding mechanism for recovery residences, whether or not it is taking the first 3 to 6 months of their stay and doing some type of stipend to that recovery residence. I've seen that a whole lot more, but nothing like Philadelphia with the yearly contract that, you know, that they are able to get. But as Stephanie said, the contract never changes and everything else goes up. Okay. And in some instances, you have to ask the question is, you know, yes, we're funded, but is it still, it's still worth us being funded?
Thanks so much, Fred, and thanks, Amy, for prompting that. We also have another question in the chat about, it's from Mina. She'd like to know more about any data challenges that researchers face, what you face. Maybe Fred, if you want to kick that off.
The data challenges, I would actually have to say when we talk about data for recovery residences, that actually is a cost for that software, and a lot of the residences can't afford it. You know, I mean, because there are many software programs right now for recovery residences. However, you know, unless you are getting funded, okay, then you probably can't afford. You know, you can't afford it.
I could speak to that too, Fred, because you and I go back and forth interviewing some of these organizations who do data, and I think they all have a great gift, and they all have something that is valuable for collecting data. Now, we're talking about not just collecting residents, you know, names and data and demographics, but we're also talking about recovery planning, goal setting. We're talking about, you know, measurement of time and disciple programs and classes and things like that can be collected, checking in and checking out of meetings and being accountable, even GPS tracking. There's so much out there. And so what I find is a challenge to find a healthy balance for your personal program. You know, you can find organizations that do so much that you don't need, and it just gets confusing. And then you can find programs that do very little, where you're missing, like most of them, I haven't really found an adequate recovery planning measurement process, meaning tracking goals. And I don't know why. I mean, I think that's number one in recovery. And maybe it's out there, but I'm still challenged. I have to do it myself physically and then kind of download it into the software and say, hey, these are the goals and things like that. But so it's a challenge finding the right one for you. I think prices are pretty okay. I mean, you can go as low as $30 a month, and then you can go as high as $500 a month. But I believe the challenge is finding the correct data measurement software organization that meets your challenges and your goals for your operation.
Thank you so much for your responses to my question. I was hoping to ask a follow-up question, if you don't mind, which is whether or how data, because what I'm hearing you say is talking about data for the individual or for you to help people track their goals and have information about themselves. I'm wondering if you use data, or if data are ever useful for securing funding, or if there's other kinds of data that are helpful.
I like that. I like that question, and I'll answer them, and I'll leave it open. But that's very critical. I left that out. It's preferred to have a data measuring organization that can collect these data, especially goals and maturity levels and recovery levels, that come together and actually can produce outcomes that we can print out or electronically send to funders and say, hey, this is what we're doing here. You know, we have 30 people graduated the program, and here's their levels. Here's their levels when they came in, and here's their levels now. There's something happening here, and you know, and so it's a good proof for you know, for funding resources. And so I liked the data measurement organizations where, you know, as we are tracking these goals and as we're tracking the demographics and we're tracking the recovery planning, we can actually print out charts of different categories, you know, and graduation rate, recovery rate, post 2 year after graduation, things like that. Those are important data for the city, for the state, for the country, and for funding, for receiving funding. Yeah.
That's a great response, John. And I hate to jump in here, but I am concerned about time. And Mina, thank you for that question. I want to highlight that I'm really hoping that folks on this call, researchers, will be thinking about questions like that in preparation for next month's webinar. Let's go to the next slide, because next month's webinar is going to be an all audience webinar. It's going to be bringing together not only researchers, but providers as well. And hopefully we'll be facilitating discussion about, you know, researchers having an opportunity to talk to providers about what their challenges are, what they're thinking about in terms of MOUD and recovery housing, and vice versa, that providers will be able to connect with researchers. So I really like that we're already kind of having that those kinds of questions bubbling up at this meeting. So that's coming up in May, May 7th. That's the first Tuesday of the month. And again, I hope that I'll see all folks who are on this call at that webinar. A couple of other things I want to bring to your attention. Also, so this month, there is the National Conference on Addiction Recovery Science, the NCARS conference. I mentioned earlier that I-STARR is part of the COARS Network, the Consortium on Addiction Recovery Science. COARS is hosting the NCARS conference, and it's all about recovery support services and recovery science. NAR, the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, is a sponsor for that conference. Folks from I-STARR will be presenting at that conference, so hopefully folks are excited about that conference and can attend. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that in addition to hosting these webinars, I-STARR also funds pilot studies. And one of our pilot studies is looking specifically at barriers to medications for opioid use disorder in recovery housing. And we have someone from that project here today to talk a little bit about that. So if we can go to the next slide, we have Rashmi, who's going to talk about the I-STARR project.
Thank you, Dr. Miracle, for that wonderful introduction. So we are based out of the University of Missouri, St. Louis, but this is a national study. And like Dr. Miracle mentioned, we're looking at some of the barriers in capacity and attitudes towards M18 recovery housing, both from the perspective of residents and from the perspective of operators. And essentially, we're looking at like why isn't M18 more widely implemented in recovery homes? Like, what's stopping this from being more common? Is it a capacity issue? Is there a hard time getting transportation, for example, or are there attitudinal barriers to doing so? So basically, the study takes about 15 minutes is a 15-minute survey for both operators and residents. I currently put the link to the operator eligibility screener in the chat. After operators take part in the survey, we will reach out to these operators with an email containing a specific resident link to be distributed to their residents. Operators can distribute that link to up to 10 of the residents in their recovery house. And then everybody will get about a $15 Amazon e-gift card for compensation afterwards. It's very important that you distribute only your recovery resident link only to 10 residents in your recovery home, as that link is tied to your recovery home without us taking down the name of your recovery home for confidentiality purposes. Additionally, please do not share our survey link on social media. We've had some issues with fraudulent responses and bots in the past, so we'd really try to avoid those. And please let me know if you have any questions. Our email is in that giant blurb of text at the very bottom. It's moistar@umsl.edu. You'll most probably just be emailing me, so you can feel free to also look me up. And let me know if you have any questions. I try to get through those emails in like at least once every 24 hours. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rashmi. Let's go to the next slide. So folks, I do want to remind people that this webinar is part of a 12 webinar series. And if you're just hearing about this webinar series, or this is the first one you've attended, you may not know this, but you can get a certificate of completion for attending all 12 of these webinars. In addition to a certificate of completion, we can also list your name, your organization as someone who's completed this training on the I-STARR website. So if you are just hearing about this, you haven't attended all 12 but are interested, no worries. We have a learning management system on the I-STARR website, and you can get caught up. You can make sure that the webinars that you've attended, again, we track those because you're here live, but the ones that you see on the learning management system, we can track your attendance too. And again, if you attend all 12, you can get some recognition for the work that you put in. So that's our LMS, and we can drop the link to the LMS into the chat for you. And then I think that we are at the top of the hour. It goes by so quickly, guys. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you again to Fred, to John, to Stephanie and Celine. Amazing presentations, and thank you so much for sharing what you do as recovery residence operators, providers. Hopefully we'll see folks back here in May for the last in the series, the all audience webinar. Take care.